When you think of ancient and medieval India, you probably picture the caste system, right? A society all neatly organized. But here's the thing. There was a whole other India running alongside it. A massive, parallel world of tribes and nomads with their own rules, their own heroes, and their own history. A history that was lived and spoken, but almost never written down. Okay, so let's break this down. On one side, you've got the Varna system, a really rigid social ladder where your birth decided pretty much everything. But right alongside it, a totally different world was buzzing with life. This was the world of tribal societies, the Adivasis. And their world wasn't built on a hierarchy at all. It was built on kinship and community. So who exactly were the people who made up this other India? And how did they manage to carve out their own world? Let's get into it. Now, you might think they were just pushed aside, but that's not the whole story. These groups actively chose to live out in remote places like forests, hills, and deserts. This wasn't them retreating. It was a powerful statement of independence and a way to protect their unique cultures from the caste-based societies that were growing in the plains. It's a great question, right? If these societies were all over the place and lasted for so long, why don't they show up more in our standard history books? Well, here's the fascinating part. The very things that kept their cultures strong also made their history almost invisible to us later on. They avoided outsiders to protect their way of life, and, this is the big one, they didn't write things down. Their entire history, their entire culture, was a living thing, passed down through songs, stories, and memory. It's a history that you had to hear, not read, which is why so much of what we know today comes from modern anthropologists who actually took the time to listen. So if they rejected the caste system, what did they build instead? I mean, how does a society even work without that kind of rigid structure? Well, let's look at the rules of the tribe. Their world really stood on three pillars that were the complete opposite of the Varna system. First, kinship. Everyone was family, part of a clan. Second, collective ownership. The land and the cattle belonged to the community, not to one person. And third, they had this incredibly deep connection to nature. They lived with the land, not just on it. Now, it's really easy to picture these tribes as just small, scattered groups of people. But that would be a huge mistake. Some of them formed incredibly powerful kingdoms that could go toe-to-toe with any others on the subcontinent. So let's put a spotlight on two of the real heavyweights, the Gonds and the Ahoms. And just take a look at this. It really gives you an idea of how widespread they were. From the Khokhars up in the Punjab to the Nagas and Ahoms in the northeast, and the Maravars way down south, this other India wasn't some tiny footnote. It was everywhere, woven right into the very fabric of the subcontinent. All right, first up, the Gonds. They lived in this gigantic forested region they called Gondwana, right, in the heart of central India. And they didn't just live in the forest, they built a kingdom from it. If you want to understand just how powerful they were, get a load of this number, 70,000. 70,000. That's how many villages were part of their biggest kingdom, Gar Katanga. This wasn't just a tribe, this was a legitimate superpower. And they weren't just big, they were super organized. They had this really smart system to manage their whole kingdom. Everything was centered around forts, or gars. Each gar controlled a unit of 84 villages called a chorasi. And then that was broken down into smaller barhots of 12 villages each. It was this brilliant, nested system of government. The Gonds were also absolutely fierce warriors, and you can't talk about them without mentioning their legendary ruler, Rani Durgavati. She famously stood up to the mighty Mughal emperor Akbar. She flat out refused to surrender, choosing to fight to the death to defend her kingdom. What a symbol of their defiant spirit. Okay, now let's travel east and meet another tribal powerhouse, the Ahoms. They actually migrated from what's now China, came into the Brahmaputra Valley, and built a kingdom that would dominate the area for an incredible 600 years. So what was their secret? How did they last so long? It all came down to this ingenious idea called the pike system. Basically, every adult man was a pike, and he owed service to the state. During a war, he was a soldier. During peacetime, he was part of this huge public workforce, building dams, roads, irrigation systems, you name it. This system turned their entire population into an engine for the state, and it allowed them to defeat even the mighty Mughals again and again. So, beyond the settled tribes who were farming and building kingdoms, there was another really important group, the nomadic pastoralists, the people who were always on the move. You can think of these nomads as the lifeblood of the medieval economy. They were living trade routes. As they moved around with their herds, they connected all these isolated villages to the bigger markets, exchanging things like wool and ghee for grain and cloth. They created this vast, moving network that kept everything flowing.
And the kings of this moving economy? The Banjaras. They were basically the long-haul truckers of their time. They traveled in these enormous caravans called tandas, buying grain cheap out in the countryside and selling it for a profit in the cities. They were so good at what they did that powerful sultans like Alauddin Khilji literally outsourced their entire supply chain to them to feed their armies and cities. That's just how essential they were.
But, these two separate worlds, the caste-based one and the tribal one, they couldn't stay separate forever. Over the centuries, the lines between them started to blur, and that led to a massive social transformation. So, as economies grew and societies interacted more, many tribal groups were slowly absorbed into the caste system, becoming new jatis. And here's a fascinating twist. Many of the famous Rajput warrior clans that rose to power in the 11th and 12th centuries actually came from these very tribal communities. Talk about social mobility. In other regions, like the Northwest, powerful tribes chose a totally different path. They converted to Islam, rejecting the caste system altogether. So you see, the story of India isn't just one single story. It's more like a chorus of many voices. By listening to the unwritten stories of the tribes and nomads, we get a much richer, more complex, and frankly, a more truthful picture of the past. And it makes you wonder, what other histories are out there, hiding in plain sight, just waiting for us to finally listen?